Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the Your Forest podcast. I'm Matthew Christoph. Realized I haven't said my name in a while. I might want to throw it out there a couple more times because people might be listening not knowing who the hell this guy is. Today's podcast is sponsored by Greenland Forestry, providing resource inventory analysis, and is also sponsored by Damaged Timber, a new sponsor. They are a apparel company, Canadian-based outdoor apparel company out of Edmonton. And they support conservation and awareness of public lands through the sale of their clothing. They're hoping to start using 10% of their profits towards a scholarship fund that supports post-secondary students in like natural resource-based programs, forestry, environmental sciences, that kind of stuff. All their products are awesome. They've got shirts and hats and toques right now, or beanies. The shirts are awesome, fit really good. They're more of an athletic fit. Really nice soft material. Hats are great. Honestly, one of the hats is my new favorite hat. It's got like a little leather patch and it's mesh back and all that stuff. It's awesome. You guys should check them out. Damaged Timber. Go to damagedtimber.com. You can find all their stuff on there. So we all wear shirts and hats. Why not support a brand that's local and gives back to the forestry community? Why not? All listeners get a 10% discount if they use the code YourForest10, and that's on top of all the sales and promotions that are already there. So it's a really good deal. Check them out. That's our new sponsor. So yeah, today I've got Kurtis Blaikie-Birkigt on, and he is the senior project archaeologist for Tree Time Services Inc. in Edmonton, and they do a lot of archaeological work in Alberta, all throughout Alberta, kind of before any kind of development is done in the forest. They go out and they test sites and they look for potential archaeological finds. So to make sure that those finds aren't disturbed or disrupted in any way, make sure they're protected and recorded, and so that we can know what's going on and understand our history and everything that's been going on out there, that we, the resources that we need to protect. So yeah, he came on and we had a really good discussion kind of explaining the details of how they do their work, how the archaeological process is done through pre-disturbance assessment and stuff like that. And it was really good. It sounds like they've gotten better at it, and it sounds like there's a lot of sites out there, a lot of archaeological finds, a lot of stone tools and other stuff like that. It's kind of all over the place, and they're starting to they're getting better at finding it. So it's really exciting to know that there's a lot of places out there that potentially, there's ancient cultures on that have, been there way before us. So it's interesting to think about. It's a really interesting podcast. It really opened up my eyes to all the important resources out there that I haven't really thought about in the past. There's a lot of history out there in the landscape, and we got to make sure to preserve that history and protect it. So it was a really good podcast. Helped me understand a lot more about my profession and what I do. So it was really good. Hope you guys like it. Here's Kurtis and I. Yeah. So first of all, just want to thanks for coming on, man. Like, this is it's been a long time coming. We've been hassling back and forth to try and get you on. You've been a busy man. So
yeah, it's been a busy fall. We had a lot of stuff come up in September, October. So
good stuff. So you just got back from Nunavut. I'm curious to see what you were doing up there. What were you guys getting into?
So that was non-forestry related.
Oh, okay.
That was an archaeology project for a community group up there excavating a Thule winter house. So it's the ancestors of the Inuit, the immediate ancestors.
Oh, okay.
And so we actually had descendants of the people that lived, the family that lived in this house in probably the 17th century. We had their descendants on site for some of it.
They knew that it was their descent.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah. That's crazy. Just from word of mouth, they knew.
Just the oral history, right? So it was maybe 7-8 generations.
Isn't that amazing that the indigenous people just have that that oral history like that, and they just keep it that's how they
it's one of the things
culture moving forward, right?
It's one of the things that we think is really novel and interesting, but it's one of the things that kind of sinks in after you spend some time on the ground and you talk to people and you read a lot of traditional land use and some oral history, and you start getting a sense of what it really means to have lived on the land for multiple generations.
No, I can't even imagine. I definitely don't have that here. Immigrants. But we'll just get into some questions just about archaeology and how it's related to the forest, and just kind of So like, first of all, like, how does that process really work? Like, I've been in forestry a while now. Like, grew up. My parents are both foresters, actually, and yeah, I never really heard it come up. Like, every once in a while, you hear about talking about arrowheads and stuff that you find, and just little things like that, right? And but I never really thought about it, the archaeology and forest management, because obviously it's got to be combined somehow. So, like, how does that process work? Who do you like? Do you get a call from the forest management professionals and they're like, hey, we found this thing, come check it out? Like, how does that all work?
Yeah, well, it's actually even ahead of that.
Okay.
So since about 2002, the forestry sector has been required to do impact assessments.
Right.
So pretty much every cut block or access road in the forest is supposed to have been reviewed by an archaeologist before it happens.
Everyone is.
Yeah. So the way it works is we get the call from the forest management agreement holder.
Yeah.
We review their annual plans or their forest harvest plans.
Right.
Take a look at those plans, predict where we think sites are likely to be, or if there's any known sites, but there's not many known already, so it's mostly predicting where we think sites are going to be.
Right.
And then
it's thick bush, yeah, so it's not like there's people are stumbling across this stuff all the time.
Yeah, and there hasn't been a lot of previous survey in these areas, right? So most of the survey in Alberta happens associated with development, and a lot of the times forestry is the first development to go into an area.
Right.
So, yeah, so if we think a place is likely to have a site, then we'll go out and we'll check it out.
Cool. So like an oil and gas, I imagine you get a lot of call from them before they're developing stuff. Or
yeah. So they do a lot of archaeology too.
Right. I would imagine they would have to. Yeah, as part of the deal. Oh, that's cool. So like, what are some of the stuff you might find? Like arrowheads. Obviously, I've heard of that. But like, what are some other like common things you guys find out there?
So it's broader than you're probably thinking of, right?
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. That's what I'm saying. I'm ignorant to what's going on. So, educate me, please.
Archaeology is pretty much anything that could be historically or culturally significant.
Okay.
And it doesn't have to be really old. So it's everything from 10,000-year-old spear points up to a 50-year-old trapping cabin.
Right.
And so that's one that most foresters have run into, trapping cabins or old trapline infrastructure or something like that.
Like abandoned cabins?
Yeah. And that stuff falls into the Historic Resources Act too.
Gotcha.
And it's one of the things we watch out for. So, and because that again is often has like active living descendant communities, right? In historic memory. So it's one of the more significant things that we run into.
Huh. That's interesting. So there's no timeline. There's no like earliest date.
No, there's no
consider it an archaeological find.
In Alberta, there's no minimum age. There's like a 50-year guideline, but really it's a matter of significance.
Right.
So one of the most recent sites that our company has found was a historic plane crash up south of Lesser Slave Lake.
I've been to that plane crash, actually.
Oh, yeah.
That's just south of my parents' place. I've been on it on the quad,
yeah. Yeah. And so that one, I think a lot of local people knew it was there, but the government didn't have a record of the location.
Yeah.
And so we found it when we were out checking out a cut block and wrote that up. And because it's a historically significant event and there's material remains of that event on the ground, and people died there. So we documented it, wrote it up. And that was actually interesting. I think we found that or wrote it up in 2013 or 14. And then this last summer, we were contacted by the niece of the co-pilot who died in the accident, who had read about it and was looking into the history of her family and got in touch with us. And so
that's crazy that nobody. I just assumed it's kind of common knowledge, like where I come from, that it's there, right?
Yeah.
There's that plane crash. Not everybody's been to it, but they know kind of the general area that it is, and it's. So when did that happen again? That was the 60s?
I think it was 76, if
76.
I remember right, yeah.
Oh, okay. So, it's crazy that it's like not that long ago, relatively, right? And so the government didn't know that's where it was, eh?
I think
there's got to be records.
Yeah, there were records of the crash, and people knew where it was.
Yeah.
But it, as a historical event, a historical site, it had never kind of been documented in that way. And that's the way it is with a lot of things, right? Old cabins, foresters know where all the old cabins are, but they're not. Part of our job is documenting those things and getting them into a place where anybody else can find out about them, and so that they're also on the listing of historic resources, so that if another development's going through there, they know it's there in advance.
Yeah, for planning purposes and stuff. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's just weird to think about that, a plane crash that happened where there was obviously a recovery, like they knew it was there. They investigated all kinds of stuff.
A lot of the plane wreckage was taken away, but some of it's still up there.
Yeah. No, that's wild. That's cool. But so like I was just writing down random things, kind of random questions that I had as far as like if you find something like that, like the plane crash.
Yeah.
Do you would you have to create a buffer around that or something, or how does that how does that change like a cut block or oil and gas development or something like that?
Yeah, so typically anything we find, we'll usually in the context of forestry flag it for avoidance.
Yeah.
Most of the time, So when we find a site, part of our requirements are to document it and to evaluate it, to collect enough information about it that the government can make a decision about its significance.
Right.
But doing that level of evaluation often costs more than the value of the timber that's in what would become the buffer area, right? Unless it's a really big site, or if it's on an access corridor or something.
Yeah.
So generally, anything we find, we flag for avoidance.
Right.
So everything from the most common sites we find are small, the remains of small campsites. So just stone flakes and stone tools. The flakes are just the garbage left behind from making stone tools.
Right. That's from like millennia ago.
Yeah. Well, anything from like 200 years ago to 10, 12,000 years ago.
Yeah.
But pretty much any site we find, whether it's a small campsite or a cabin or anything, we'll flag it off, just put a buffer around it, and it'll be left intact. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So who's responsible for, say you have to go in and protect a site or something like that? Yeah, who is that the forest company that's like responsible to protect that? Is that the government or
so we're hired by the forestry company,
okay.
right? So the mill, an FMA holder or a quota holder,
right?
And they hire us to review their plans,
right,
and do the impact.
And that's to ensure that they're doing their due diligence, right? But
yeah.
I'm more talking like if something is found that's beyond their scope, like say you find like a big burial site or something that needs to be. I guess they would just avoid it, and then you're good.
Yeah. So as long as they're avoiding, if you get into a situation like there's been very few in the forestry sector, but let's say a major access road needs to go through a site.
Yeah,
that's where
like that.
You'd have some back and forth with Alberta Culture and come up with a mitigation plan for it. So we'd go in and do some data collection. So usually on an archaeological site, that'd be like excavating, right? Like you see on TV.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So like you're talking about. Flakes. So you're saying like how could you tell the difference between I was going through your blog that you sent me there and I can kind of tell the difference. You can see that they're on the flakes versus just normal rocks there's some clear like it looks like something's been bashing against something else, right? There's some clear some smooth edges and some sharp edges and stuff. But like do you guys have difficulty finding those things or you guys get a pretty keen eye for it after a while, I imagine?
You get a keen eye for it. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky because a lot of the time people are using local stone.
Right.
But generally, it's the shape of it and the context of it. There's specific characteristics that you see when somebody's working stone that you won't see from almost any other way that stone can break.
Right.
Specific characteristics on the flake. You'll have these smooth facets, and you'll have multiple flake scars, we call them, where previous flakes have been broken off of a piece, and then that one comes off, right? So it's very rare that a natural process would do that.
Right.
And then sharp edges and that sort of thing. And also the context. Yeah, if you're finding pieces of broken stone in wind-blown silt, right? Then that's a pretty good hint too, right? That people put it there.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. No, it's interesting. So for like as far as what's the most common thing that you guys end up running into out there?
Yeah, so the most common sites are we find stone flakes.
Stone flakes.
So because we're working in the forest, everything's covered by moss. So the only way that we find sites typically is by digging small test pits.
Right.
So
those are randomly.
We pick our spots pretty carefully. Yeah, but we'll pick a target landform that we want to look at. We'll go to it. We'll put in maybe 8 or 10 small test holes to see if we find anything. Those are just about a foot square and dug down maybe a foot deep, and that gets us into mineral sediment.
Right.
And we screen the dirt out of those. And if we find anything in those, then we know there's a lot more there. Right?
I
see.
It's
just a really small sampling. So that's the most common thing we find is those stone flakes. If we're lucky, we'll find stone tools like stone knives or scrapers or arrowheads. Yeah.
So if you say you do a plot like that, right? Soil pit, and you find something, do you keep going till you find it all, or do you just say, okay, we found stuff here, there's you should avoid 10 meters that way or something like that? Or how do you go about doing the avoidance?
So we have a kind of a semi-systematic approach to it. So we'll go in, we'll pick the spot we think is most likely to have artifacts. And if we find anything, then we'll test out from there semi-systematically, usually at 5 to 10 meter spacing. But still kind of picking our spots, right? After you've done it for a while and you've found some sites, you start getting a feel for where somebody would have been doing their stone tool working and leaving where you're most likely to find the flakes.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a semi-systematic approach, and we try to get out to where we're getting 2 or 3 negative tests in a row.
Okay.
And then we'll put then we have an idea how big the site is, and then we'll put a buffer on it just for the uncertainty.
Gotcha.
If we need to tighten up that buffer, we can do more testing to do that.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Oh, that's cool. So I'm just thinking about like you guys find, I read on your thing that you're talking about like atlatl points.
Yeah.
And I think people probably don't know what an atlatl is, but it's just if I'm correct, it's like one of the original projectile weapons, right? Like
yeah. So there's kind of the technological evolution is from kind of a handheld thrusting spear to a thrown spear to what's called an atlatl dart, which is it's kind of like a javelin, but it's thrown with a throwing stick, and the atlatl is the actual thrown stick or throwing stick.
Yeah.
And it was still in use by the Aztec when the Spanish encountered them. That's why we use an Aztec word to describe it.
Right.
But it's a stick about the length of your forearm.
Oh, okay.
And it's got a hook on the end that hooks into the back of the spear.
Right.
And then it acts kind of like a JLI scoop, right?
Yeah.
For throwing when you throw a ball to your dog.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
One of those, just an extension of your arm to give you more throwing.
And those things were, I didn't realize that they were using that in North America too.
Yeah. So they were used. It used to be thought that there was like this steady march of progress from a thrown spear to the atlatl to the bow and arrow around 2,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But
well,
there's been
2,500. That's okay.
Yeah, that's the introduction to the bow and arrow in North America, probably.
Yeah.
Spreading from the Arctic down.
Okay.
But the atlatl, there's been some evidence coming out of ice patches in the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah.
Finding maybe that earlier than we thought that some of the points that we thought were on spears were actually on atlatl darts.
Oh, okay.
And they were used, like I said, the Aztec were using them right up to the historic period. And I actually saw an article recently about Inuit hunters hunting seals in Alaska, still using them to hunt seals off the bow of their boat.
Currently.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So.
So how do you tell the difference between like a spear and a bow and I'm guessing a bow is smaller, and then a spear and an atlatl, like it's just a size difference or how?
Yeah, it's mostly size difference and how they were attached to spears. But because we get really poor organic preservation in a lot of North America, a lot of it is still conjecture or theoretical on where that transition is. But it looks like it's mostly size based. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so like a spear is probably the biggest ones you guys find. How big are those generally?
They're smaller than you'd think, probably. Yeah. So, well, you get some of them like Clovis points, right? That's really famous, and some of those are enormous. But we think people were probably kind of showing off on those, like up to a foot long, right?
Dad, look at my spear.
Yeah, some sort of a prestige item. But typically they're maybe like 10 centimeters long. It would be a big spear, like a big early spear point from 8,000 to 10,000.
Do some damage.
12,000 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then atlatl or dart points are probably typically about half that size.
Okay.
So like, I don't know, 3 to 5.
So the atlatl and the bow tips are about the same.
And then bow and arrow is, so arrow points are way smaller than people would imagine. They're typically just a couple centimeters long.
Yeah.
And there was a study done to try to define the difference between atlatl darts at the very end of when they were used and the first bow and arrow points around 2,500 years ago, because they're all basically triangles with notches in the sides. Mm-hmm. But there's a difference in the width of the neck between the notches.
Oh, I see.
So bow and arrow is about a centimeter and atlatl's bigger than that.
Gotcha. Okay.
So yeah, pretty small. So if you typically what people would pick up and think, oh, that's an arrowhead, would have been an atlatl.
That's probably what I like. All the ones I've seen, I think, are probably atlatls then, because they're not. Yeah, they definitely weren't. A centimeter or two. They're like bigger than that.
Yeah,
probably like 3 or 4.
Whereas an arrowhead would be like the end of your thumb.
Oh yeah, no, I've never seen one of those. I don't think. Or I've seen them actually at the University of Victoria has the Aboriginal exhibit there, where they have all the the totem poles and they have all that stuff.
I haven't been there.
Oh no, yeah, I think they have I'm pretty sure it was there. I saw they had a whole layout of all the different kind of spear points and stuff like that. And I think there I've seen the actual really, really small ones, right? But that makes sense, I guess.
Yeah. So and at the Royal Alberta Museum, the old exhibit there had they had a really great display.
That's right.
It went all the way through.
Maybe
time.
Maybe it was there. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
I'm not sure. We'll see what's in the new museum when it opens up.
Yeah, I don't know when that's supposed to open up. It seems like it's been in construction forever, but so you're talking about the landforms and stuff that you guys get used to finding, kind of knowing intuitively where people might go for that kind of stuff. So do you find these kind of stuff, like the stone tools specifically, in riverbeds and stuff, where you find rocks, or is it kind of, or how do you where do you tend to find these things in relation to the landscape itself?
Yeah, so typically the spots we're looking for are places you would think would be a good campsite. So we're generally looking for high, dry ground close to water.
Right.
And we're staying inside the cup blocks too, right? So,
right.
A lot of those high potential locations are inside of riparian buffer zones. So the other thing we look for is these landforms that are a little bit back from the creeks.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but like high point terraces or little knolls that are near a wetland area.
Right.
Yeah, those are the kinds of places that people would have used
So you would go into where the like riparian buffer would be just to check. Then I'm guessing. Hey,
no, we typically keep out.
Just stay in the cut block.
Our focus is trying to find the sites that are actually threatened by development, and trying to minimize the impacts of those.
Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, cool. That's interesting. So it's how often do you guys find that kind of stuff?
We do pretty good. Yeah. Almost every day, every couple of days. Like we're averaging about, so we pick out our target locations when we review the harvest plan, and we're averaging somewhere between 10 and 20% of our target locations have a site in them.
That's crazy.
And we try to do 4 or 5 a day.
Yeah.
Right. So we're aiming for like a site every second day.
So there's a lot of it out there.
Oh yeah. That's one of the things, so 15 years ago, when we started doing surveys for forestry, there was almost no known sites in the boreal forest that weren't right on a major river or lake.
Right.
And it was kind of assumed that those hinterland areas were really sparsely or never occupied.
Yeah.
But one of the big things that's happened in the last 5-6 years, once we got LiDAR, we started being able to pick out those nice landforms and spend our time looking on them instead of just wandering through the forest looking for good spots.
Yeah.
And we started finding a lot more sites. And so we're really filling in the forest. And
that's awesome because it's one of those things where, being like cutting or laying on a cut block or when I'm out hunting or hiking or whatever, right? You're like, oh, I might be somewhere where nobody's ever been, but like now that's making me rethink all of that.
Yeah, I remember every time I used to think that I'd find a stubby beer bottle.
Yeah, there's always that too. Yeah, you always find some garbage. Yeah. People are horrible that way. I just forgot my question there, but what was I going to say? Oh man. I need to start writing these things down more often. I get carried off on tangents and forget what I'm going to ask. But so you guys find those stone tools pretty much everywhere. Then that's wild.
Yeah, so we find sites not everywhere. Like we can kind of predict they're still patterned, but they're we're starting to find some new patterns, right? So we find sites on pretty small creeks. One of the things we're really paying attention to now is little wetland areas up in the uplands.
Oh, really?
And looking for hills around those, right?
In the wetland.
Yeah, so right on the margins of those wetlands.
The edge of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that might be, in some cases, those wetlands used to be lakes before they kind of filled in and closed in.
Right.
And in other cases, they're, that's like prime trapping and moose hunting habitat.
Right.
So,
lots
and
of
it's one of the things,
and
it totally fits the pattern that you hear from contemporary indigenous people, right? When you ask Cree hunters about how people use the land. They talk about the same patterns. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. By wetland, you mean like even like black spruce bogs and stuff like that, or you mean okay?
So, bogs, more like those open treeless bogs.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So really wet stuff.
Little hills around the edges of those. We're starting to find some really cool sites around.
Okay.
That. Yeah.
Oh, I remember what I was going to say. There's LiDAR.
Yeah.
I've talked about LiDAR in the past on the podcast a little bit, but I'll just explain quickly what it is. And it's just light detection and ranging for those people that don't know. And it's basically a pulse shot down from an airplane flying above. And it's kind of like radar, right? It gets bounced back, and they get a height off it, right? So and so we get, so you guys use mostly the bare earth.
Yeah, so we use the bare earth hillshade layers, and it's like looking at a picture of the ground with all the trees stripped off.
Yeah.
At really high resolution. So where it used to be, when I started out 15, 16 years ago, we were using, like 1 to 50,000 maps. And you'd look at these cut blocks and you say, well, this cut block's close to a creek, so I guess I'll go hike through it and see if I can find any nice spots.
Yeah.
And now we look at it and we can zoom right into like 1 to 2,000 and look for the exact spots that you're going to want to put your shovel and to look for a site. So.
Right. No, that's cool. So you're just looking for those kind of knolls in the middle of riparian kind of areas and stuff.
Yeah, that's one of the easy ones that really stand out on LiDAR. Are things like hills and terraces and elevated points. But it also lets us look for other features. So one of the things we're starting to pay more attention to the last few years is looking for ancient landscape features.
Okay.
So up in the Slave Lake area, we've done some work mapping out early glacial lake levels of Slave Lake. So as the glaciers retreated, the lake was dammed at the east end.
Okay.
And so at one point, the lake shore was all the way up to like almost to this town of Swan Hills.
Oh, really?
Right, and Deer Mountain up there, so like way up in the hills. And then over...
For people who don't know, that's like... What's the elevation change there? It's like a few hundred meters for sure.
Yeah, it's huge, right?
Yeah.
And then over 2,000 years, the lake kind of dropped down to close to its modern level.
2,000 years? Yeah. That's how long it took?
And so there were people living on those lake shores, right? And so we're on LiDAR, you can actually see old beach ridges from those lakeshore levels.
Man, you got to show me some of this stuff because that's
Yeah.
interesting. I have all of that. Yeah, you should show me some of that.
It's pretty cool. So we've done a couple things on our blog about it, kind of highlighting those. And we have found a couple sites on these ancient beach ridges that are probably from like the lakeshore 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. But one of the challenges with that is we haven't found anything we can date, right? We haven't found organic material we can carbon date or points that we know are from a certain time period.
Right.
And those beach ridges, while they were a good place to camp when the lake was up there, they're also a really good travel corridor through the landscape, right? They're this nice level gravel road basically through the hills. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that's crazy. So as early as 2,000 years ago, you think that lake was up in
no, it took about 2,000 years for it to drain. So yeah, it would have started maybe 12,000 years ago and been drained down close to its modern level sometime between 8,000 and 9,000. We don't have good dating on it.
In my mind, anytime I ever heard like my dad used to always talk about Swan Hills and Goose Mountain area and stuff like that, and talking about how that was all underwater.
Yeah,
back in the day, where it was all one giant lake. I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But like in my mind, I'm thinking like, 500,000 years ago or something like that, but not while people were around. Like I can't even fathom, because it's not like the other side of those hills. There's not more hills. Like there's a little bit of a ridge, like Martin Hills and stuff like that on the north side of Slave Lake. Like
that would have been ice, right? So the glaciers were on top of the Martin
so I see,
Hills.
right. So it's right up against the top of the glacier.
So the glaciers were melting back towards the north.
Okay.
And so on top of the Martin Hills would have been ice. And then at the east end of Lesser Slave Lake, where the Athabasca comes out there and drains east, that valley was blocked by glaciers, right? So the whole area was actually at one point draining southeast, down through into Glacial Lake Edmonton. That was all lake too. And then out the Saskatchewan drainage. So because there was a massive wall of ice blocking the northeast.
It's like Game of Thrones, man. It's amazing to think about that stuff. Eh?
It's pretty cool when you start trying to imagine what the landscape might have been back then, right? And it was there was probably no forest for a long time, right?
Well,
it was like open grasslands or like almost tundra, right?
Yeah. It's all rocks and just
Yeah, so that's one of the things we have to think about too when we're looking for sites is right now you look at these hilltops in the middle of the forest and they're just a hill surrounded by trees. But if you take the trees off, right, like if you go into a cut block after it's been harvested, you realize, oh, hey, before the forest closed in here, this was a great vantage point where you could see for miles and miles, right? You could watch for bison, or maybe even before that, some of the Ice Age stuff. Like,
megalodons and whatever else. Or,
like mammoths and stuff, horses and
the horses. That's a weird one that when I first realized that all canids and all horses originated from North America. Yeah. Supposedly, that's what I was told. They all originated here, and then they went extinct here. They traveled across the land bridge or whatever, right, or the ice bridge, and they went extinct here, and they were still around in Europe and stuff like that. And that's how, and then they came back.
Yeah, so that's going back. That's going back like when they spread out millions of years ago.
Yeah,
and then they went extinct at the end of the last ice age. So that's around that 14 to 10,000 years ago. Right. But there were camels and horses, wild camels and horses in Alberta. And they were hunted by people. So
giant sloths.
Yeah, giant
sloths blew my mind.
I don't know if we found any archaeological sites with giant sloths up this far north, but I think in Florida they've got some.
Florida down there, eh? Yeah. If you've never seen like something of a giant sloth, look it up. It's insane. It's a crazy creature that exists. Like they have in Drumheller in the museum there, they have a bunch of not the actual skeletons, I guess, but the made up skeletons or whatever, right? It's crazy to see that stuff was real back then, walking around here. That's cool. So like that was like the LiDAR and stuff like that. That's going to be a huge advantage for you guys trying to like narrow down these sites and stuff. So how much, like, you guys probably gained a lot of efficiency out of that, eh?
Yeah, I think we're finding 5 to 10 times as many sites now with the same amount of effort.
Man,
just because awesome. We're not wasting time wandering around looking for good spots to test. We just pick our spots, go straight to them. Yeah. One thing we have noticed is that wandering around in the forest, we kind of found more incidental stuff, right? We don't find as many cabins as we used to.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of other people keeping their eyes out for cabins. So.
Right. Yeah, so like trappers' cabins and stuff. There's still people around that know where those things are, and they kind of they'll show up. We can find them on imagery and stuff.
Yeah, you guys.
Right?
So layout people. We've done some training classes with layout contractors to kind of make sure they're watching out for that stuff too.
Right.
So
it's crazy to think that the whole 10,000 years ago that whole landscape would have been completely different. Glaciers and giant creatures and water up to the top of Swan Hills, which
Yeah.
for people that aren't from here, they probably don't know what the hell I'm talking about, Swan Hills and Slave Lake and that, but you can Google it. You can see on the terrain map how tall it is. But yeah, it's amazing to think about that stuff. And it's never something I considered when thinking about forest management, right? It wasn't on my plate. So it's interesting. It's another perspective that I have to add into my professional career, that's for sure.
Yeah, one of the other areas there's some overlap is some of the archaeological evidence from about 4,000 to 8,000 or 4,000 to 7,000 years ago.
Yeah.
The climate was a lot warmer here in Alberta. And that might give us some information about kind of what to look at or what things might look like if it warms up here significantly again. Yeah. So in that time period, we actually find point styles, so this is atlatl darts, going back to that earlier one, that are associated with like plains bison hunting culture up in the whole Cold Lake Lac-La-Biche region.
Gotcha.
So that might have been the tree line might have moved a couple hundred kilometers further north.
In that, it's weird to think about right now. Like you have a lot of climate scientists coming out and showing the projections on where forests could potentially move to, right? Saying that like the climate for these forests is moving northward or whatever, right? And or higher in elevation, and you think, well, yeah, that's great, but it takes, if it takes 60 years for a generation of trees, then it's going to take a long time for them to move back that far, right? But it's interesting to see or to know that that's come and gone a bunch of times already, right? So it's totally possible that the whole forest could easily move backwards. It'll take time, but if the climate changes, then they won't have a lot more coming up. It's one of those things that we kind of think the permanence of the forest, right? I think are like just currently we kind of think, oh yeah, the forest is there, it's all good, like we don't have to worry about it. It's kind of permanent, right? But it's not. Like it has to be protected. It has to be we have to make sure that we're doing things properly, because it could easily go away, I suppose, right?
Yeah, there's a perception that kind of the environment that was documented at the start of this century basically is the way things have always been. Yeah. But yeah, even that, if you go into the foothills, if you look at historic records and also, again, ethnographic records, so like the oral histories of the indigenous people that live there talk about how there was way less forest in the foothills 100, 200 years ago. Yeah. A lot of the valley bottoms were open, and even
200 years ago. Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, so it's fire suppression has really closed it in.
Yeah, so, I suppose, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, man, there's a whole bag of worms there. Yeah, that's wild. But yeah, the archaeology thing. So are you guys? So you work for just Tree Time, right?
Yeah. So Tree Time Services.
Okay. Yeah. And is there a lot more people similar to yourself doing this, or is Tree Time pretty exclusive?
No, there's probably 4 or 5 consulting companies that do some forestry
in
work.
Alberta.
Yeah. We do about half the forestry in Alberta. And
gotcha.
Then, there's also a lot of forestry archaeology in BC.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, there's a lot of forestry going on over there. So
and there's a lot more First Nation engagement too into the archaeology process and into forestry
in British Columbia. Yeah. Oh, okay. I wonder why that would be.
Different political and historical context.
Yeah, I guess that's
a lot of it has to do with the treaty history. Right?
Oh, I suppose.
Northeastern BC is under Treaty 8, but the rest of BC isn't, and so they've got more modern or more recent
updated
agreements. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. Oh, that's crazy. So besides we're talking about you said trappers cabins and historical, like the plane crash sites and the atlatls and stone tools and stuff like that. Do you guys ever find, like, was there ever like pottery or like any kind of, or do you find like leather or anything like that on these kind of sites?
Yeah, well, it's super rare to find any organic material in the boreal forest. Because the acidic soil just
eats it up.
Yeah, it just eats it up.
Yeah.
But we do every once in a while. So one of the things we look for is the kinds of places where we might find organic material. So places that like down in a stream valley that get buried quickly.
Right. Okay, just from erosion and stuff.
Yeah, so if you get a flood, that can bury a site, and then you might get that preservation. So we watch for that. You asked about pottery, and that's actually one of the really interesting topics in Alberta archaeology right now. So there's Aboriginal pottery in southern Alberta. It's associated with like the ancestral Blackfoot and the Blackfoot Confederacy. But there's very little in northern Alberta, but we're starting to find some more.
Okay. So you just haven't found it, you think?
Yeah. And so right now there's been a few finds. Yeah. Lac-La-Biche, Cold Lake. The furthest northwest that pottery has been found, indigenous pottery has been found, is on Fawcett Lake at the east end, which is just east of Lesser Slave Lake. And one of the cool things about it is all that pottery that's being found in kind of the southeastern boreal forest in Alberta is of a style that's really different than what's further south in Alberta. but it's really similar to pottery from west central Manitoba and central Saskatchewan.
Oh, okay.
So what that looks like is probably ancestral Cree territory
in the north.
That we're kind of identifying, pottery that's been left behind by the ancestors of the Plains Cree.
Right.
I don't know if you're familiar with it. So one of the big debates in history and prehistory in Alberta is how long have the Cree been in Alberta?
Okay.
Right. There was one of the earlier models of history kind of treated the Cree as middlemen that just moved ahead as kind of the bow wave of the fur trade.
Okay.
But finding this pottery here and dating back to maybe like 1200 AD is showing that there's a much longer history of the Cree being in central Alberta.
That's crazy. I didn't even know. Like, I just mentioned pottery just kind of off the top of my head. I wasn't sure if the like traditional Indigenous people around here actually like had the right resources around to do pottery and stuff, but they did. We have the right clays and stuff to do that, eh?
Yeah, we've got clay. The big issue with pottery is like portability.
Oh, okay.
So if you're, and again, it speaks to kind of some of the myths that we have about what Aboriginal life was like in Alberta.
Yep.
The idea of people just wandering around.
Oh, for sure. Like, I definitely don't know anything about it.
Yeah. And so to have pottery, you have to be invested in a place, right?
Yep.
And so people were actually spending a lot more time in one place. They'd have semi-permanent camps or villages almost in major locations, and then spread out at certain times of year.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but there's definitely, there's pottery in southern Alberta, and there's some in the eastern forest in Alberta. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Do you guys ever find like how often you come across, or have you ever come across like skulls of like species that have gone extinct or whatever, or bones or whatever, right? Like, do you ever come across that kind of stuff?
Pretty rarely. So the stuff that again,
you said organics.
There's
right?
the organic preservation issue, and we're mostly looking at pretty recent history. So since the last ice age, like 12,000 years. So in our forestry work, we sometimes find like moose bone, right? And maybe buffalo bone,
right?
And some volunteer projects that we found some extinct horse.
Oh, really?
Like 9,800 years ago, 10,000 years ago at the Brazeau Reservoir. And that's a pretty cool site. Yeah. But in our forestry work, it's pretty rare.
Yeah. I guess you're just not at the level that those things would be at, right? For the depth of the soil and stuff like that, probably, or okay.
Yeah. So the depth and the kinds of deposits. So Alberta is starting to look more and more for ice age animals. So that's from like 10,000 years up to about 100,000 years.
Okay.
And that stuff often, so that's like mammoths and saber-toothed cats, that kind of stuff. And that turns up in gravel pits a lot.
Oh, okay. Really?
Yeah. And there's similar to what we do archaeologically for the forestry sector, there's paleontologists that work for any industrial development that might impact those kinds of deposits, right? So a lot of gravel, oil and gas.
I guess that makes
mining.
sense. They're getting in there, and those are so yeah, that makes sense, I suppose.
Yeah.
Just kind of,
Yeah,
cool.
But mostly what we're looking at is the stuff that's been left behind by people living on the land over the last 10, 12,000 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. So you guys are all over the province, obviously, eh? Just whenever you...
Yeah. So we, our company mostly works in northern Alberta. We do a little bit of work in the south in the parkland, yeah.
Okay.
But throughout northern Alberta, whether it's in the foothills or in the Slave Lake region, we do a lot of work, some up in the Athabasca-McMurray area.
Yeah.
So wherever there's forestry, and all the way up to high level. Yeah.
Yeah. So. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, archaeology. It's definitely outside of my wheelhouse for sure. Like but it's good to meet someone like yourself who's actually who's doing that, because like I said before, growing up I didn't hear a whole lot about it, but you always thought it was cool to find those arrowheads and stuff like that, right? But never really thought about it in the big context of things. So.
Yeah. So and that's what really kind of attracted me to it. I remember my first day working, right? Yeah. So I went through school to do archaeology. I went to field school, and then I got a summer job. And my first day of work was doing forestry surveys, archaeology surveys for forestry up in the Swan Hills. Oh yeah. And growing up, my family's from High Prairie, and I had uncles with a trap line up in the Swan Hills. Yep. So we used to spend time up there every winter, and I always wanted to just go wander around, right? Just go see what's back there and see, and imagine how people used to live up there. So I got up there to do that my first day of work, and I was hooked, right? Yeah. That's all I've wanted to do since.
So, I could see that. Like the Swan Hills, it's up in Deer Mountain and Goose Mountain and all that stuff. It's a beautiful area. Like my dad would say it's God's country. Yeah. It's nice stuff. And there's always, I think the the artifacts that I've found, I can't even remember if I found them or if someone else found them that I was with, but we found like little arrowheads, or I guess they would have been spear points or whatever, right? But it was only ever in Swan Hills area, where you get those rock deposits or something. You see it just kind of sitting there or something. It was
you get really shallow soils, so the stuff turns up more easily. But also, like Deer Mountains is one of the major archaeological hotspots in the boreal forest.
It is, eh?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's two types of stone up there. So right on the top, there's a really good stone. I don't know if you've probably, when you've been up there, there's like that thin layer of like really dense gravel on top of all of that. Yeah. And so that gravel is millions of years old, but it's from when the Rocky Mountains were much bigger, and streams were depositing that gravel on the plains in Alberta, and it was a really high energy environment. So everything fragile got destroyed, and there's just this really good quartzite that's left up there for making tools. But then also there's bedrock deposits coming out about halfway down Deer Mountain of a type of chert, which is similar to flint. Okay. We call it Grizzly Ridge chert. That's also really good for making tools. So at Deer Mountain, you've got this quartzite on the top that's good for making really durable, really hard tools. Okay. And then you've got this chert coming out halfway down someplace on like Chalmers Creek. There's probably outcrops. We haven't found them yet. Yeah. That's really good for making fine, sharp tools. Oh, okay. Yeah. So it looks like that was probably a really important place that people used for a really long time.
So the chert is a softer mineral.
It's more brittle. Yeah.
It's more brittle.
It's hard, but it's brittle.
Oh, and I see.
It makes really sharp edges.
So you said the quartz is good for strong, and the other one is good for hardness.
For sharp.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So what would the quartz be used to make?
So that one, the quartzite cobbles would be used to make, so you break off a big piece, and they'd be used for like hide scraping tools. Oh, I see. Things that need to put not too sharp an edge, but an edge that'll last a long time.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and then the chert flakes would make little knives and arrowheads and stuff.
All that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's cool. So you find, I guess, you just find, again, it all comes back to the organic. I was going to ask about like knife handles or something like that, or like full air, but it's same organics again.
Yeah,
right?
not in. That's one. It's a really frustrating part of working in the boreal forest is that we're only finding maybe 5% of people's toolkit. Right, we're finding the sharp bits. We're finding the tools they use to make everything else. But we know, so ethnographic records, historic records, that 95% of what people use was organic, right? And you see, like the people of the boreal forest, the ancestors, the Cree and the Dene, were amazing woodworkers and made so much stuff out of wood and out of cordage too, right? Yeah. Things like nets, fishing nets, and snowshoes and all of that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. And we don't find that
out of sinew and grass or something, or just
sinew, spruce roots,
yeah,
for making cordage. So we don't find that in northern Alberta much, but if you get up into the very northern edge of the boreal forest, up in the Yukon, you get better preservation. Right. And the project I was up on up in Nunavut was really cool because there was organic preservation. You could see how similar tools to what we find would have fit into a larger toolkit.
Okay. Yeah, I imagine everything freezes up there, so it lasts a lot longer. I imagine.
You get the permafrost.
Yeah. So do you get to go up into the north very often?
No, that was a pretty unique experience. Oh, yeah. So I've done a little bit of work in the Northwest Territories, trying to get some work up in the Yukon.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like a pretty interesting area because, like you said, there's a lot of permafrost. There's a lot better preservation, I imagine, the biological material. That's cool.
Yeah. So it's great to provide that context and help put together the whole picture of what the little bits of evidence that we're finding, what they actually represent.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It's such an interesting. Yeah, I need to spend more time looking into this kind of stuff. So I'm glad to have you on. But what about I just lost my train of thought again. I'm tired today. But just thinking about this whole thing has got me thinking about the grand scheme of the whole forest and kind of its relationship with everything, right? So how old do you think, you're saying it's hard to date these kind of findings, these stone tools and stuff like that. But if you how long ago do you think that that those tools were stopped being used?
Stone tools?
Yeah.
Yeah. So metal tools and other trade goods coming in from the fur trade would have started to show up in Alberta around 1700, 1750, and they'd have been pretty dominant by the 19th century, the 1800s.
Yeah. So by the 1800s, they're probably not using stone tools
not for like everything. Yeah. But there's definitely the earliest historic records we have still talk about people using stone tools, and some for some specific uses, people use them right up into the 20th century.
That's
so
awesome.
the big one being hide scraping.
Right.
There's ethnographic work, which is like cultural anthropology. People going out and spending time with modern indigenous people.
Getting that oral history, I imagine.
Yeah, in northern BC and the Yukon, and people were still using stone hide scrapers because for some things, right, that it has like the perfect edge, right? It's sharp but not too sharp, and it lasts really long, doesn't wear out as fast as steel. Yeah. So in some cases, stone tools were used right up to then.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm just that's. Yeah, I kind of figured that some things they're just readily available, right? Like the stone's right there. They don't have to go to market and go, trade some beaver for a knife or whatever, right? They can make it. So I imagine they're probably using it as much as they could. But yeah, it's interesting to think. So you don't really have much of an idea for when you find something. There's no way to date it really.
The two main ways to date something, if we find a site, is if we can find organic material, so bone or charcoal or even burnt bone. We find some burnt bone, and the radiocarbon dating techniques are getting better. They're getting to the point where a chunk of burnt bone the size of like a pencil eraser, might be dateable. So if we find that, we can get a date off of it, or a bit of charcoal. And the other way is stylistically. So if we find what we call a diagnostic artifact, like an arrowhead or a spear point, that the style changed through time, then we can say, well, we found this one. It's what we call an Alberta point. And we know those were made about 9,000 years ago. So we know this site was occupied then. There's some experimental stuff going on trying to use other dating methods. One of the big ones, optical spin luminescence, portable optical spin luminescence, and it's similar to radiocarbon, but instead of radiation, it dates sand grains by how it can tell how long a grain of sand has been buried, because it slowly accumulates energy from the soil, and if it's exposed to sun, that energy is released. Or to heat. And so there's some experimentation, because if we can start actually dating the soil, then we can date almost any site, right?
Well, that's kind of what I was thinking, right? So can you explain just like the carbon dating, kind of how that works, like what the science is behind that?
The atmosphere, the carbon in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there's two types of carbon. There's carbon 12 and carbon 14, I think.
Okay.
And there are two
I
isotopes.
Can't correct you, so we'll go with that.
I can't remember if it's 12 and 13 or 12 and 14. And one of them is slightly radioactive. And then through the process of radioactive decay, that the radioactive portion of it slowly breaks down. And
so you measure that decay.
Yeah, it changes from 14 to 12.
And you know how long it takes to decay.
Yeah, it takes about 5,600 years for half of it. That's its half-life. Yeah, so every 5,600 years, there's half as much radioactive carbon. So yeah, if we find organic material, we can test how much radioactive carbon is in it, and compare that to what we know the baseline was. It fluctuates a little bit through time, but that gives us a pretty accurate age, and that'll let us date things up to about 40,000 years old, which is everything that we would find in Alberta.
That's cool. So how is that a pretty expensive process, carbon dating? Or
it's a lot cheaper than it used to be. So a sample is $300 to $600. To get one sample, So the hard part's in the boreal forest is finding an organic sample.
Right. So that's just the price for the carbon dating, not the price for finding it, and excavating it, and all that other stuff. So
that takes more.
But
if we find something that's if we find organic material and it's from a context, like if it's definitely associated with artifacts, then it's worth dating to try to find and get a date on that.
So the same thing with the charcoal, then just carbon dating with the
so charcoal or bone.
Do you find a lot of that? A lot of just like charcoal pits?
You find charcoal everywhere. So that's one of the
mostly from forest fire.
Right? So it doesn't matter where you're digging, you'll find charcoal in the duff or just under the duff. So we have to be pretty skeptical and be pretty careful about what we're collecting and make sure it's associated with artifacts.
No, that makes sense. That's pretty much it. I've written down for questions, but is there anything that you kind of think, anything off the top of your head you think that like the public or professionals might want to know about like the archaeology in the forest and how it's related and all that stuff? Just I think the mic open to you. Go for it.
I think we touched on a lot of the big things, right? Like, so people have been living in the boreal forest in Alberta for for at least 10,000 years, and people have been everywhere, right? People have left their footprint across the whole landscape, right? And we're just starting to kind of piece all of that together.
Yeah.
And that goes right up to the contemporary times, right? So one of the things I think people might be interested in, and one of the things I've found really interesting is finding the history of early forestry in Alberta. And that's one of the things that we found. So early logging camps and tie cutting camps for the railroad.
You find saws, like crosscut saws or anything like that?
A couple, I haven't found them, but people I know have found a couple. But mostly it's lard cans and condensed milk cans. But it's still kind of interesting stuff. Yeah.
No, that's cool, because I imagine that information was probably lost. I imagine nobody was writing that stuff down, or if they were,
I don't think there's much records of forestry operations before, say, like the 60s, 70s.
Yeah, that's a crazy one. When you're going through like a mature pine stand and you find a stump, right? And you're like, this stand's 120 years old. That's a stump. It's like, how old is that, right? Or it's barely a stump at that point. It's all moss covered and there's nothing really left of it. But it's interesting to think that there could have been, there was activity, anthropogenic activity from like modern anthropogenic activity. Yeah. Going that far back, right?
I was in one stand once and it was like really heavy mature fir, and I was wondering why it was all fir. And then we started finding all the spruce stumps, right? So it had been selectively cut in the 20s. Yeah. Yeah. So
that's crazy. Logging back then must have been such a chore. Yeah. Horses and like saws and everything's manual. Yeah, I can't even imagine that.
It's one of the things I like about it, is that perspective. My grandparents and great grandparents were in the forestry sector in the 20s and 30s, working the first Miller Western camps. And,
nice.
And so just trying to get a perspective of what their lives were like compared to what our lives are like. Man, I think that's one of the things I really get out of archaeology, is an appreciation for what we've got now.
Yeah, I can't even fathom what their lives were like, relatively speaking. Like I have family in Nordegg and an outfit business, and he spends a lot of time out in in ranger tents and stuff like that, right? And when I'm out there, that's kind of what I imagine that kind of stuff was, right? Like, but even us being out in the ranger tents, we've got way more technology than they did, right? We still got like satellite phones and radios and flashlights and shit like that, right? And meanwhile, back then they're working off of candles and maybe not even that, just whatever, right? To see
like
at night,
oil lamps,
and
whatever.
Yeah. So it's I can't even fathom what they must have went through.
They're
tough people,
tougher
for sure.
times. Yeah. It was funny that I was talking with a bunch of foresters in a course once, talking about how we're finding these tent platforms and appreciating that I get to work in the forest and don't have to spend 6 months in a tent. And some of the older foresters in the crowd were like, well, that's what I did when I started out.
Oh yeah, I know exactly. Yeah. Well, even my parents, I'm sure they could tell me stories about that kind of stuff. And I enjoy doing that stuff, but you know what I also enjoy? TV. I imagine it was pretty interesting back then, but man, I'm appreciative of technology. But yeah, thanks a lot for coming on. This is awesome. I think this provides a lot of perspective for a lot of people that probably don't get the opportunity to hear from like an archaeologist and the history kind of going back, right? Like, I think like even myself thinking about like trappers' cabins, I'm like, oh yeah, it's an old trappers' cabin. Just kind of move on from there, right? Never really thought about like, oh, this could have been built 120 years ago. Could have been a guy that
might have a lot of family history tied up in it.
Well, that's what I was thinking.
Interesting things that happened in it.
It could have been somebody that they spent their whole life in that cabin. It wasn't a cabin to them; it was their home, and they survived off of furs and whatever they could get. Right? Like, so it's interesting to take a step back and actually appreciate that kind of stuff, right? Because I've definitely taken it for granted, right? Yeah. All that kind of stuff. Or you find old bridges that that's close to cabins and stuff like that. So, and even that plane site. Mm-hmm. Right, the plane crash was not something I was like, oh yeah, like it was super fascinating when I stumbled across it, and it was really interesting. But I guess I didn't stumble across it; I had known about it, but I didn't. We were driving trying to find it, right, and all the quads and stuff, but never really thought about the idea that there was no archaeological record of that and historical record for people knew kind of where it was, but nobody really knew where it was. So it's definitely widens my scope of understanding for forest management, that kind of stuff. So
and so that's what I really appreciate the show that you're trying to do, to share kind of the aspects of forest management people don't know about, and I thought this is one of them, right? That the forestry companies are out there trying to manage this non-timber value on the landscape, right? These resources that
they probably don't know
that a lot of people care about, and wanting to. And don't realize how much work the forestry companies are doing to protect them. So.
Yeah, that's what I think, right? People, like when I first started this a few months back, I was thinking that whenever I talk to people, I tell them I'm in forestry. They just think, oh, like you just rape and pillage the landscape. You're the bad guy from Avatar, right? I'm like, well, not exactly, but okay, if that's what you think. And it's kind of frustrating to get that, right? So I wanted to, yeah, that's exactly what I want to start this, right? Just kind of get the information out there, realize that the management that is going on is super in depth and nothing's being taken for granted. Everything's being considered, and there's values, there's watershed values, historical values, there's indigenous values, there's wildlife values, there's everything. Everything's under there, right? So it's for myself, I'm learning so much from this podcast. Getting like I got a few guys coming on to talk about water, like drinking water risk with relation to climate change and increased fire activity and that kind of stuff, right? And it's just interesting to get that perspective because I haven't found a lot of easily accessible information, right? Like the information's out there. There's lots of people doing the studies, or like yourself doing this historical studies and trying to find these things, but it's just not. There's no easily absorbable format out there. So this turns out I've been happy with this. It's been good.
Yeah. The forestry sector hasn't been great at getting the story out, but it's good to see it starting. So
yeah, I'm talking to people that are. It's funny when I talk to other forest professionals, right? And they're like, yeah, they agree that it's just we've been too quiet in the past, right? Haven't been speaking up for ourselves and kind of promoting the industry, or not even just the profession itself, and environmental management in general, right? So it's good that I think word's starting to get out, so people start to listen to this and maybe get a different perspective, if nothing else, right? Yeah, even if they don't agree, whatever.
Yeah, well, it's I think the more we communicate about what the sector is doing, I think the more people
will get it, right? Yeah. So those are the people we're reaching for. The unreasonable people are unreachable. Anyways, well, thanks a lot for coming on, Kurtis.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, this is awesome. Okay. If anybody has any questions, or for me, or for Kurtis, you can go ahead and shoot me an email at yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll hopefully answer your questions. But besides that, if anyone out there can give me a hand, do some rating and reviewing, that would be awesome. Really helps me out, lets me know what people like and what kind of content to keep putting out there. So yeah, thanks for listening, guys. See you next time.